Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to this video tutorial on getting started in Pro Tools 11. In this video, I'll be showing you the basics of setting up a Pro Tools session, recording audio, importing audio, recording with virtual MIDI instruments, and some basic editing, as well as bouncing out a final project. I hope for this to be the start of a series of Pro Tools videos similar to what I did with Logic 10. However, unlike the Logic series, I don't plan on covering some of the more mundane features of Pro Tools, just the important points. But I will go in a sequential order just like I did with the Logic series. And yes, I know that Pro Tools 12 just came out the other day, and frankly, I don't care. I'm probably not going to make the jump to PT12 for another year or so. All right, so let's get into it. When you open Pro Tools, you'll usually get this quick start menu, which allows you to set parameters for your session and also allows you to choose between creating a blank session, opening a recent or other session, or creating a session from a template. If by chance you don't get the quick start menu, you can go up to File, New Session, or press Command N or Control N on a PC to create a blank session. In this same window, you can choose whether you want to create WAV or AIFF type files in your session. It really doesn't matter which one you pick because they're both uncompressed audio formats and there's no difference in quality. You can also choose your session's sample rate and bit depth, which does affect the quality of the recording. The sample rate is the number of samples per second taken during the analog to digital conversion process within your audio interface. Bit depth refers to the number of bits, the ones and zeros, recorded per sample. To keep this brief for an intro video, just know for now that higher sample rates mean a higher frequency range for your recording, and higher bit depths result in a wider dynamic range for your recording. But bit depth doesn't really affect overall volume too much. It has more to do with the inherent floor noise being lower at higher bit depths. You can also choose to have stereo recordings saved as interleaved files, which means that stereo audio is recorded as a single 2-channel file rather than 2 separate mono files for left and right. I'm going to go with 2448, hit OK, and then I'm going to name my session and save it to the desktop. And then this is the main window for Pro Tools. This is called the Edit window. The Edit window is where you can create different types of tracks, including audio, MIDI, and even video tracks. This is where you can record audio or MIDI data and store it on a timeline. You can also edit that audio or MIDI data within the Edit window. So let's create a few tracks for our new session. You can go to Track, New Track, or just press Shift Command N or Shift Control N for PC to bring up the New Track dialog. So in the New Tracks dialog, you can create one track or multiple tracks, and you can also create multiple different types of tracks. For this project, I want one mono audio track for recording DI guitar, one stereo audio track for a drum loop, and one stereo MIDI instrument track for bass guitar. You can quickly toggle between stereo and mono by holding Command and pressing left or right, and you can also cycle through the different track formats by holding Command and pressing up or down. You can hit the plus button to add a new track row. Here I'll create a stereo audio track for my drum loop, and next I'll create a stereo instrument track for my MIDI bass that I'll play in with my MIDI controller. For now, don't worry about the time base options, the samples or ticks menus to the right. Just use whatever the default option is, which is samples for audio tracks and ticks for instrument and MIDI tracks. All right, so we'll hit Create, and Pro Tools creates the 3 tracks for us. All 3 tracks are selected in white, so I'm going to hold Option and click on them to deselect them. You can rename the track names just by double-clicking on each one. So I'll name the first one Guitar, but you can actually press Command up or down to cycle through the different track names to name them in a sequence. So this is nice if you want to quickly rename tracks without having to double click on each one. So now that we have our tracks ready, let's talk about setting up your audio playback engine. The playback engine is essentially the audio interface or I/O device that Pro Tools communicates to input and output audio signals. So say you want to plug a mic into it or you want to plug your guitar into it. To set up the playback engine, go to Setup Playback Engine. Here you can see that my audio interface says Sapphire. It's a Focusrite Sapphire 56 Firewire interface that has 8 mic inputs and 10 analog outputs. with multiple chainable digital I/O. Yours could be something simpler like an Avid M box, but you can actually run Pro Tools without an audio interface at all. You just won't have any good way to connect a microphone or an instrument. If you don't have an audio interface, you'll have to use the built-in output or built-in speakers option, which plays the audio output through your computer speakers or audio output jack. But then you'll be left not having any way to input audio. So having an audio interface is a necessity even for any hobbyist or home studio situation. If you change your audio interface, Pro Tools will prompt you to save, close, and reopen your session. This will happen automatically and you won't lose your work. Pro Tools just needs to reboot to load the new playback engine. Since I'm sticking with the Sapphire, I'm just going to hit cancel. The other important part of the playback engine setup is the hardware buffer size. This is essentially the amount and rate of information that your computer's CPU will process. The reason why this matters for audio is because if you set the buffer too high, you'll get noticeable latency in your recording path. If you're tracking vocals, this means that you'll hear a slight delay between yourself singing and the monitoring playback in your headphones. This can obviously be distracting. If you use a lower buffer, you'll eliminate a lot of that latency, but the CPU is going to have a hard time processing all of that information that quickly, so this can cause Pro Tools to stop playback and give you an error message. The general rule is to use lower buffers for recording and higher buffers for editing, mixing, mastering, and just general playback that doesn't involve recording. One other thing we want to look at is under Setup I/O. This window shows all of the input and output paths for your audio interface. Sometimes these paths can be improperly set up, or it's also possible that someone has customized the I/O paths, which is causing you to not hear playback or be able to record properly. So these are all of the inputs I have available for my interface. You may have more, you may have less, and they may be named differently depending on what interface you have. These inputs can be analog mic inputs, SPDIF digital inputs, or even optical inputs like mine has 16 additional optical inputs. As a safe way to reset all of your inputs and outputs, you can press Command A to select all of the paths, and then press Delete on the keyboard, or just press the Delete Path button. Then what you can do is reset your paths to default by pressing the default button. I recommend doing this for the inputs and the outputs, especially if you're working on a shared computer, because you never know what the person before you did with the I/O. So now I'm in the Output tab. So I'm seeing all of my interface's outputs. See the monitor 1 and 2 at the top? That's my main output where my speakers and or my headphones are connected. So I need to make sure that the output of all of my tracks goes to that stereo output path so I can monitor and listen to and get sound out of Pro Tools. Since we reset the I/O, the tracks have gone gray and the I/O section on the track header says no input, no output. So now we just need to assign the correct inputs and outputs for each of our tracks. Let's assign the output first. You click on the Output tab where it says no output, go to Output, and then choose Monitor 1 and 2 at the top. Now keep in mind that your interface may automatically name this path differently than my Sapphire does. Some common names are A1 and 2, Analog 1 and 2, Out 1 and 2, Output 1 and 2. Just keep in mind that you're going to choose the topmost stereo output path regardless of what your interface has named it. You can also hold Option or Alt on a PC while clicking on the output path. It'll assign that output to all of the tracks in your session, so you don't have to click on each one individually. Now for the inputs. The drum loop and MIDI bass don't need inputs because I'm not recording any audio for those, but my guitar track does need an input path. So I'll click on No Input, go to Interface, and I'm going to choose Input 3 or IP3 in my case. Again, yours might be named differently. A lot of times they're named A3 or Analog 3 or just Input 3. I'm going with Input 3 because my guitar is currently connected to Input 3 on my interface, and it's going to an instrument level input. To test for sound, you click on the Arm for Recording button and just play to see if you get sound. If it's too soft or too loud, you may need to adjust the gain on your audio interface. So it looks like I'm getting sound just fine. Now, if you're doing this with a mic to track vocals or some other instrument, you'd go through the same process. You just make sure that you plug your mic into a mic level input. All right, so our IO is all set up and ready to go. Just a quick note before we start recording, if you don't see the IO section on your track header, you can click on this little icon and hide and show certain parameters. The only ones we need for this video is the inserts A through E and IO. We don't need anything else at the moment. This little red icon is showing you the starting tempo of the session. Double click on it to pull up the tempo window, or I'm going to change the tempo to 115 beats per minute. Why? Because the drum loop I'm going to use is at 115 BPM, so I just want to match that. Next, I'm going to create a click track under Track, Create Click Track. This is just a metronome click to keep me in time while I play. Let's test the click to see if it's working. Just press the spacebar to play and the spacebar again to stop playback. So it looks like it's working. You can also resize tracks by clicking and dragging the bottom divider between the tracks. As an additional time reference, I'm going to drag in a drum loop from my desktop. To import it, just drag it directly onto the stereo audio track you created. The loop looks pretty zoomed out, we can barely see it. So let's zoom in to see it better. One way to zoom is to use the plus and minus buttons on the bottom left corner of the edit window. These will let you zoom vertical or horizontal. A quicker way to zoom horizontal is to make sure that the AZ button up here is on. This is called key focus mode, which opens up a whole bunch of other quick shortcuts when it's on. With key focus on, you can just press T or R on your keyboard and zoom in and zoom out horizontally, which is much quicker than using the plus and minus buttons. Next, I want to create a bit of a lead-in between the start of the session and when the drum loop starts to give me 4 beats of count-in before I start playing. To do this, you want to make sure that we have a musical grid to snap to, so you want to make sure that grid mode is on. If you work in slip mode, you can move the clip freely, but it won't snap to the grid. So make sure that grid mode is on to snap the clip to the grid. So I'm just going to pull out this loop and snap it directly to the start of measure 2. If you don't see grid lines at all, just make sure that you have this grid button up here on and make sure to choose an appropriate grid value. I'm going to choose a quarter note, which is pretty typical. Next, let me show you the basics of the 3 main edit tools. The grabber tool allows you to move clips around. The selector tool allows you to select a range of the clip and delete it if you like. I'll hit Command Z to undo the edit. And the trim tool allows you to trim the audio from the left or right side to shorten it up. There's also a smart tool that turns on all 3 of these at the same time. The top of the clip becomes the selector, the bottom becomes the grabber, and the left and right become the trim tool. All right, I'm going to pull down the drum loop track and just resize the track a bit so I can see it better. And I'm going to make a duplicate of this loop 2 times. This is pretty easy to do. Just click on the clip with the grabber tool and then just press Command D 2 times to make 2 duplicates, or if you're on a PC, press Control D, that is. And ignore this window that pops up. I just pressed the wrong button, that's all. All right, we're finally ready to record the guitar. I'm just going to turn on the Record Enable button on the guitar track and then press Command Spacebar or 3 on the number pad to start recording. When you're done, just hit Spacebar to stop. All right, so that turned out pretty good. I'm going to double up another guitar recording to make this a bit thicker sounding and to give it a bit of stereo width. You can right-click on the track name and choose Duplicate, and we're going to duplicate this track with all of its settings. However, I'm going to delete the original clip on it and re-record another guitar part to layer it up. Also, if you notice this blue arrow, this is your playhead. So if you stopped playback, there's a chance that the playhead stopped and is staying where you stopped the playback. It depends on what settings you have selected, but we'll go over that in another video. For now, just know that you can press enter or return on your keyboard and the playhead will return to the beginning of the session. Let me just rename these guitar right and guitar left, and I'm going to pan the left all the way to the left and pan the right all the way to the right. So this will give us a bit of stereo width. I'll also pull down the volume on the tracks a bit. If you find that adjusting volume and pan from the edit window is a bit clunky, you can actually press Command equal sign or Control equal sign on a PC, and it pulls up Pro Tools Digital Mixer, or the mix window. You can control pan, volume, solo, mute, and record enable all from here as well. This is generally my preferred method for adjusting these parameters just because I find it's a bit less clunky and I can dial them in a little bit better. You could also, what I'd like to do is I put the mix window on a separate display and then I have my edit window on another display, and so I can see both my mix and my edit window at the same time. All right, so let's record our second guitar. All right, that turned out pretty good. Before we move on to the bass, I'm going to do some basic heads and tails editing to the guitar tracks. I'm going to use the selector tool with slip mode to trim up the front end of both of the guitar tracks, and then I'm going to put a quick fade on them to hide the edit. You can create a fade in Pro Tools by making a selection with the selector tool and pressing Command F. This brings up the fades dialog, which lets you adjust the shape of the fade that you want. A quicker way to do this is to make sure that the key focus mode is on and just press F instead of Command F. This doesn't bring up the fade dialog, but it gives you a stock linear fade. You can actually change this in the preferences though. So I'll do this to the tail end of the guitars as well, and I'm also going to fade out the drum loop. The next thing I want to do is add a bit of an amp effect. The guitar is just DI, so it's pretty boring right now. Using the inserts on the tracks, you can add plugin effects to the track. This includes EQ, compression, reverb, whatever. I'm going to find the 11 Free plugin under Harmonic. 11 Free is a free guitar amp modeling plugin that comes with Pro Tools. Let's solo the guitar and see what this sounds like. Yeah, that's a cool amp tone, but it's not really what I'm looking for this song. Let me change the amp type to the Vintage Crunch option and tweak the settings a bit. Yeah, that's a lot better. I'm going to hold the Option key to drag and duplicate the plugin down to the next guitar track. Yeah, that sounds great. You can also add or view your inserts from the mix window. All right, let's work on the MIDI bass. Since this is an instrument track, it simply records MIDI data from a MIDI keyboard or other MIDI controller. So I'm going to be playing these notes on my Novation Impulse 49, which is just a small USB MIDI controller. To add a virtual instrument plugin to the instrument track, you go to Inserts, Multi-Channel Plugin, Instruments, and then choose which virtual instrument or synthesizer you want. For this, I'm going to be using the Expand 2, which is a decent sample-based synthesizer. To hide or show any plugin, you can click on the actual Insert tab in the Insert column. From the Presets menu, I'm going to choose the Hard Finger Bass under Basses. To test for sound, just arm the track like we did before and play a few notes on your MIDI controller to see if you get sound. All right, we're ready to record our bass. Just arm the track for recording like we did before. Hit the return or enter key to return the playhead to the beginning. And then just hit Control Spacebar or 3 on the number pad to start recording. All right, that turned out pretty good. There were some slight timing issues and a bad note in there, but these things can all be easily fixed with MIDI. Using the grabber tool, you can double-click on any MIDI clip and open it in the MIDI editor. The MIDI editor has its own grid, just like the edit window. I'm going to set this grid to eighth note triplets because that's the groove I was playing. Most of the time, standard 4/4 grooves are just 8th note or 16th note bass, but this one just had a bit of a triplet swing feel to it. I'm also going to use the grabber tool and my zoom keys, T and R, to zoom in and select and delete a wrong note that I played. We can also quantize all of our notes in the MIDI recording to snap them to the correct position. You can select all of the notes with Command A and then go to Event Operations, Quantize, or press Option 0 to pull up the menu more quickly. You can see that when I zoom in that these notes are slightly off the grid lines. Quantization just snaps these notes to the nearest grid value that you set. For my bass line I played, I want to choose 8th note triplets, although most music that doesn't have a swing feel to it can be quantized to 8th notes or 16th notes. So I'll choose my quantization value of an 8th note triplet, hit apply, and you'll see that now the notes snap directly to the grid. I want to add a fade to the bass, but you cannot use the normal fade tool to add fades to MIDI clips. You have to actually create a volume automation change. To do this, you have to change the track view from clips to audio volume, and then use the grabber tool to draw in a fade. Now that I've got my automation fade, I'm just going to change the track view on the bass back to clips. And one quick thing, if you have a bunch of tracks that are all at different sort of zoom levels and you want to set them to be all the same, you can just hold Option and click on the divider between the tracks to make them all the same. Let me just mute the click track and let's give this a listen. I think I'm going to make the fades on my guitar and drums a bit longer. Now we're ready to create a final mixdown of the project so it can be rendered into a single stereo audio file. This is called bouncing the track. To do this, use slip mode and the selector tool to select a range of the bounce. Also make sure that your click track is muted, otherwise you'll hear the click and the bounce. So using your selector tool, make a selection for the range of the bounce. You don't actually have to select everything. You can actually just select one track, but we're just defining where the bounce is going to start and stop. So after you make the selection, all you have to do is go up to File, Bounce to, Disk, or you can press Option Command B. And what it does is it brings up the bounce menu. In here, you can choose whether you want to bounce to a WAV, AIFF, or even an MP3 format. I'm going to go with WAV. You can choose whether you want an interleaved file, multiple mono, or summed. Multiple mono creates a separate left and right file for your bounce. Mono sums the left and right channels together. I'm going to stick with interleaved because I want a single stereo audio file. I'm going to keep my bit depth and sample rate exactly the same as what we said at the beginning of the video. And I'm just going to give my session a name. I'll just call it Test Demo. You can also choose what directory you want to save the bounce to, so I could put it on the desktop if I want to. But in Pro Tools 11, there's a new bounced files folder within your project, so I'm just going to save it there. The last option is to choose whether we want an offline or real-time bounce. In Pro Tools 10 and all previous versions of Pro Tools, you had to do real-time bounces, which means that you had to listen to the entire song while it's bouncing. So if it was a 3.5 minute long song, you had to sit there and wait 3.5 minutes. With an offline bounce, it greatly expedites this process because a 3.5 minute song might only take 30 seconds to bounce. So we're going to hit bounce. It's going to render everything as a single audio file. I'm going to make sure to save my session by pressing Command S. I can now minimize Pro Tools, go out to my test session folder, and inside here I can go to my bounced files folder. And here is my test demo. So let's listen to it. All right, that sounds great. So one last little bit of information before we end the video. Pro Tools saves all of the session information and audio files to your session folder. So in my case, the one that's labeled test session. Make sure when you move your session from place to place that you take the entire folder. You can't just move the main PTX session file because that file only contains session data. It doesn't contain the actual audio files we recorded. It remembers where the audio is supposed to be placed, but not the actual audio files itself. So if you move your session, don't just move the PTX file because there's a good chance your session won't work properly if you do that. If you liked the video, please leave me a thumbs up and leave any comments or questions in the comments section below. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.